It's 6 in the morning. We are headed to our gate, and I'm very, very excited. So we're gonna get some B-roll on the way through there, and I'll see you guys in Virginia.
Are on the road to our campsite in Blackwater Falls State Park. I think we just crossed the border into West Virginia.
Well, yeah,
About a mile back, yeah. So country roads are taking us home. Not that fast right now, obviously. But we are heading to our home. I promise you.
How much longer do we got?
We have 1 hour and 44 minutes, which when we get moving again, I'm sure I can cut down to 1 hour and 30 minutes. But yeah,
It sounds a little.
the good thing.
Sounds illegal.
I mean, like, what is legal, what is not? I mean, everything's so subjective, right? The good thing is that it is a gorgeous day outside today, so like we're not doing this in like the rain or a blizzard. At least it's like reasonably good driving conditions. But yeah, no, I'm looking forward to getting there, and this is perfect weather to set up camp. We'll maybe get some. I think there's a restaurant actually outside of the park, so maybe get some food, maybe get some hiking in, and yeah, and I think after that, the handing the reins of the show over to you.
Whoa!
3 dead in a crash on a number 4. 2 witnesses blowing up high. Not sure whose will be done. You can call me a sinner for wondering why. Hey darling, sleeping on the blacktop. Hey darling, running through the trees, honey. Hey darling, leaving for the next town. Lesson my set sketches up with me. Hey darling, sleeping on the blacktop. Hey darling, running through the trees, honey. Hey darling, leaving for the next town. Lesson my set sketches up with me.
Basically set up for camp, but we have a small problem.
And
that small problem is not so small. So, quick recap. It downpoured a lot, so we are currently sitting in the car.
Enjoying nature's bounties.
Yes, whiskey is one of nature's bounties. Many, many bounties. So that kind of put a stop on things for right now. I don't know why I moved the camera like that, but so once it stops raining, I guess we can finish getting set up. But until then, cheers.
Make the best of it. Cheers.
Woo!
Day one, baby. So my name's Joseph Digby, and I'm from Falls Church, Virginia. This trip to Blackwater Falls has been just a real dream of an experience, honestly, because I haven't been to somewhere like this in quite a long time. The trip didn't start out the smoothest. You know, we had some hiccups, a rainstorm. My car was having problems starting up this morning. But honestly, I think it was great because I think back to my first times camping, and I was in Boy Scouts as a teenager. And the first times that I went camping, I didn't do so well, right? I forgot things or
got lost, things got wet, and your sleeping bag is not the most comfortable when it's drenched in water because you put it at your tent at the bottom of a hill, right? But that's what I love about camping. That's what I love about hiking and just being in the outdoors, is that you don't have as many of the conveniences, the luxuries that you have in your regular kind of urban, suburban living. And it's really an opportunity to test your wit and your craft and your skill. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an adrenaline junkie, but there's nothing quite like the success of putting yourself in a situation where, it's a challenge.
My name is Daniel. When I was about 14, we took a trip up into the Colorado mountains. It was one of the most phenomenal experiences that I've had. We backpacked up into the mountains, me and a large group of people. We set up camp, and I remember that night we had a fire, so we lit the fire up, and it was awesome. We were roasting marshmallows, everything like that, laughing. But towards the end of the night, the camp leader decided that he was just going to extinguish the fire. But we weren't going to bed. He was just going to extinguish the fire because he wanted to show us that once the fire was extinguished, after our eyes adjusted, you could see the entire Milky Way from where we were camping. And I just remember laying back in the grass and staring up at the galaxy, and I just remembered that this is cool. This is where I want to be. This is where I want a lot of my experiences. So Merriam-Webster quite literally defines home as a place of residence. So it seems very fitting, based off of the old song, Country Roads Take Me Home, that
It's a classic.
We talk a little bit about what home means,
Yeah.
So when the word home comes up, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
I do think about the fact that it has to be to some degree, a physical place, like a geographic location, right? But I think it's definitely a lot more than just a geographic location, because, my apartment is a geographic location, but my office is a geographic location. My library is a geographic location, but only one of those places is my home. So why do I call one of those my home? Because certainly I live in my apartment, but there's plenty of people who have multiple residences, right? Like Bill Gates owns 11 houses. But which one does he really, call his home? And I think that sort of distinction lies beyond just the geographic. I think that lies in the auspiciousness and the memories and the emotions that we've assigned to those places and think of when we think of those places. So for me, I think it's where, I think one of the things we've discussed earlier is that idea that home is where people think of and remember you fondly, and that you do the same of the people who are there. But another way you could say it is that you have your body, you have your mind, but you also have your soul. No matter what your religious beliefs are, I think a lot of people believe in that concept. And I think, in a way, your home is where your soul resides to some degree. That's where your soul gravitates to.
Yeah. I always used to refer like home as the place that I lived the longest. So whenever somebody was like, "Oh, like where are you from? Like where's home?" I never considered it where I was at that moment or anything like that. I considered it where I had the most memories, like you were saying,
Yeah.
where I had spent the most time of my life, which in this case would have been New Mexico. And I always called New Mexico home. But as I took time and lived further away, moving to Michigan and everything like that, I started to realize that to me, like, home is where I feel most comfortable. And home is where I feel at ease. Like a place, like a safe,
Yeah.
kind of like a sanctuary space that I can come back to, and also feel, loved and appreciated in.
Yeah, and that reminds me of those words you use, loved, appreciated. They say, your true family and your true friends are people who don't just make you feel loved and appreciated, but celebrated, right? And I feel like that's definitely also an aspect. It's like the combination of all three, of feeling that you can be your true self, and you are actively being, your true self in that space. Like that's the best space for you to do so, because I think about what you said about New Mexico, but then moving to Michigan. And, it's in a way it's similar for me, because I think about how I grew up most of my life in Michigan. And in many ways I think about, even though now I live in Virginia, I always introduce myself as, hi, my name is Joseph. I live in Virginia. I'm from Michigan, right?
Right.
And so I think in a certain way I'm kind of in that transitional phase where I decide, whether Michigan really is still in some symbolic way my home, and I'm just kind of out here on the East Coast for a little while, and then eventually I'll go back home, or if this is going to be my, my permanent home after a few years. And I think a lot of people do that, when they move. I talk to like friends who, for example, they grew up, their families were in the military, and they had to do that once every couple of years.
Yeah. And I mean, I grew up in a military family, and we moved around a lot. Granted, a lot of it happened like before I was 8, probably. I think 8 is when we ended up in New Mexico. So everything before that, I believe we moved almost 9 or 10 times.
Oh, wow.
Between me being born and 8 years old. So I think as I've gotten older, I kind of associate with that time a little bit, that at that time it's really hard to find or to like feel like you have a home, because you're bouncing around so much. But I think it's kind of made me realize that home doesn't have to be one specific place.
Yeah.
Like
that's
home can go wherever you want it to go.
Yeah.
Home can be as many places as you want it to be.
There's this woman, I forget her name, but her on Instagram, she lives in one of those school buses that she's renovated the interior to be, it has a shower and a kitchen, and she lives in there with her two dogs, right? And it's like that place, that bus, moves around obviously, but that's her home, right? And wherever it is temporarily becomes home for her. It's what's in the bus that makes it her home, right? And I mean, the fact that your family was with you in these different places, that's what made it your home, because your identity really was at that time based around your family. And that brings me back to that idea that you're talking about, now you kind of think of Michigan as your home, because I think to a degree your identity has changed, and the important people in your life haven't necessarily, like the most important people are still there, but there's more of them. And now the ones that you kind of define your immediate identity and your daily activities, right? The ones that really define that part of your life, those ones have changed. And I think that's really like a tipping point for a lot of people, is when they start thinking, okay, like, wow, yeah, like this really is my home. You know, like I know this area, I know the people. Like this is where I live, not just in the physical sense, but where, as an activity, right? You know, we think about life as not just as a physical state of being, a biological state of being, but a series of continuous activities and a pattern that defines who you are. So,
Absolutely. And oh my God. I'm not crying, I swear. Oh Jesus.
the thought of home does that to you.
The thought of home just makes me blow smoke in my eyes. And I was looking up a lot of definitions of home, and there are very many, like the Merriam-Webster one. I believe Google defined it as like a place of residence usually associated with like a family or something like that. And I mean, where do you see like the breaking line of like, you know, like home is where your family is, but then if you were to move away, like when does that move away point like become home, if you're going by like that
Yeah,
definition?
no, that's a good question. That's a really good question. That makes me, I don't really think about myself in this regard. Actually, that makes me think about my father, actually. Because my father was born in Mumbai, or, Bombay, old name, Mumbai, India. And then at 5, he moved to Montreal. And then he lived in Montreal for a few years. And then he moved to Brampton in Ontario. So he stayed there for several years. He went to college, and then eventually he met my mother. And then he moved to the United States in New York. And then they moved to Michigan, right? And they moved around to a couple of towns before they settled in Ann Arbor. And I always know, in a certain way when I talk to my dad, like I know he's a guy who his home is in Ann Arbor, but I always kind of wonder, there's multiple versions of my father. And there's this thought that I have of, in a way, we carry each version of ourselves as we go through our ages, the child version of ourselves, the teenager, the young adult, the middle-aged adult, and eventually, the old, the elder. We carry all of these ages in ourselves simultaneously. So where does that tipping point happen? I think it's when, the people that your primary family, and whether that primary family, you are at the head of it, is another important factor when that starts to change. Because I think my father, always thought as Brampton, even though he technically was from India, and he does think of himself as an Indian, and he also thinks of himself as a Canadian, but it wasn't until he met my mother and moved to New York and he became the head of his own kind of family unit, even if it was only him and my mother, that he really started to think of the United States as my home. And then especially when his children were born in Michigan, he said, Michigan is my home. And when he and his wife and his children had been living in Ann Arbor, Michigan for like about 5 years, and they bought their first home there, moved out of graduate student housing, he was like, Ann Arbor, Michigan, specifically, is my home, And I think that's the thing, is you get more settled into these roles and these, this is my family unit that that I work with it, but maybe that's the best word I can think of right now. But this is the one that I'm most closely involved with. I think that's the tipping point.
I like that. And I definitely think that your concept of home changes along the way, especially from when you're young. Like, your home is where your family is. Once you get older, home still may be where your family is, but once you create your own family, it kind of makes that tipping point into that.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes along with the idea that there's not just like one place that you can call home. I mean, for some people that is true. Some people are born in one spot, and they like stay in that same city, stay in that same town,
Yeah.
and they start their own family there, so they can literally just call that town like their home, like that's where they
Right.
were. So I guess the concept gets kind of, it's really different depending on like who you are, what you've done. It depends on your life.
Yeah. I think there's also something to be said for the feeling. You know, they say like I feel at home here, right? And I think there's something to be said for that as well because, you know, before I like permanently moved out of my parents' house like for good at 26. You know, I had been in college and moved around and moved back in, you know, in off years, moved out. But I'm permanently moved out at 26. But you've been to my apartment, you've been to my dining room, you know, and I set my dining room up in a very specific way. And it's not to emulate the experience of eating at my parents' house, which at that point was still like my most recent memory of home. I set that up to resemble my uncle and my aunt's house in Canada because for me, like the best memories of breakfast and like family conversations often were had in their dining room as they cooked like a very standard breakfast, but it was just always made with love and made you feel like everybody was involved in it. You know, you'd have bacon, eggs, hash browns, some sausages, maybe some breakfast vegetables like peppers, onions, tomatoes. And you have some coffee and sit while everything was cooking, and we'd talk about life with my aunt. And then everybody, you know, I was always one of the first people awake, and everybody would start trickling down, and we'd all kind of get involved and say hi, talk about like, how'd you sleep, what's the day gonna be like, and that organic feeling of family in that room, you felt at home, right? And so that's always the kind of experience I try to recreate for people who come to eat with me, because I feel like, you know, the center of a home, in my opinion, as somebody who's kind of family oriented, is the dining room, because that's where most family experiences are held. And you'll see in a lot of homes where it's a one family home, right? The dining room, that single home tends to be oriented around the hearth and the place where the food is made, because it's such an important part of the family experience. So I feel like you can have a home, but also have multiple places where you feel at home, because there's that intangible aspect of your permanent home, right? That kind of carries into these spaces. And sometimes you feel more in those spaces than you necessarily do on average in your home, but in, you know, in particular ways. And like, for example, right, my aunt and uncle's house, that was, you know, the breakfast in the mornings and those conversations.
I love that, because it almost seems like you've taken your concept of home and the way you've created it and built your concept is by taking like small pieces out of other people's concept of home. You know,
Yeah.
like you're reaching out, and I mean it's not even like learning what home is. You know, that happens when you're like a very young age. Like you understand that home is where your family is. But as you get older, like how your concept develops, I think is like looking at other people,
Yes,
and
yes,
like
exactly.
how their home, or what their home is, or what they consider home, and kind of like picking out little concepts and melding it into your own like new
Yeah,
concept of
yeah.
home.
I mean, it's kind of like how you see in like on somebody's living room or in their kitchen, right? You see they have all these pictures of people, right? And it's all those people, so those pictures of them are these memories that you take and you want to hold them in your daily life. That's why you have pictures of them, to remind you daily. And I feel like it's the same way with these practices of how we create home, right? Because I really think home is built on, again, like on a pattern of these activities that we use to create a space that makes the soul feel comfortable. The soul can gravitate towards this space and not have to be defensive or, you know, just be vulnerable, to put it that way.
But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that my concept of home was handed to me by any means, but I definitely learned it, like you said, by picking up pieces from everybody. And I mean, that's the thing, is like my concept of home is certainly not exactly what my parents is. Yours probably isn't exactly what your parents is, or any of your friends, because that's the thing. I think that's where the importance of the individual comes into play. You can define something by, or at least get closer to defining it by defining what it's not, right? And that always makes me think, when we think about home, let's think about people who feel like they don't have a home, right? There's obviously folks who are homeless, but I think a more kind of important example here is folks who can afford to own a dwelling, like an apartment or a condo or an actual like house, and yet they don't feel like they have a home. They might have multiple properties, or they might just move constantly between properties and not feel like they're really comfortable anywhere. And it's always like, well, why do they feel that way when they have all the physical securities? To me, that speaks to and obviously this is my opinion, but I really think that speaks to the fact that a home is about more than just bricks and mortar. It's about how it makes your soul feel comfortable and safe. And I think a lot of those people, when they describe like why they don't feel at home, they often are referencing points about like, oh, I don't really know anybody there, I don't feel comfortable, or I don't have familiar spots, right? And it's often things based on emotion and bonds and patterns of their relationship dynamics with people, even if it's just somebody as like surface level as the barista that they see every day at their coffee shop, right? Or the person who cuts their hair every time they go to the barber. If they feel like they don't have these things, eventually, if it all just feels random and they feel lost in this sea of honestly just chaos that we call life, even if you can live somewhere, I don't know if you'll feel at home. So
The crazy thing about that, though, is a lot of those people who say, like, I don't know what a home is, or like, I don't have a home, they still have the concept of what home is.
Yes.
But they haven't had the means to like achieve that concept yet.
Yeah.
Because they still have like in their head, they're like, oh, this is what I think a home should be. But
because they know enough about it to know they don't have it. That's
indeed,
such a good point.
So they still have the concept, but they just haven't achieved that concept yet, or nothing in their life up to that point has led to the achievement of the concept that they have in their brain. But I think it's kind of cool that what home is such a malleable topic, in the fact that you have a different concept of what home is. I have a different concept of what home is. Like, everybody here at this campground has a different concept of what home is.
Exactly.
I mean, I understand there's everybody has different beliefs and stuff like that, but something as core as home, like what home is, everybody has like a different idea of what it is, and that just kind of blows my mind.
And to tie it back to that song that really kind of started this whole conversation, right? The gentleman says, to the place, where I belong, right? I think maybe it all kind of boils down to that, is that sense of, based off of everything that I think compromises or composes my identity and my sense of self, and what I think my place is in the world, and what I owe to the world, and what the world owes to me. This is where I belong, to achieve all of these things, to actually achieve that, the word that you use. Oh, wow, that's such a good word. To achieve all of those things, this is the place where I belong. I need to be to do that.
So as this trip has kind of come to a close, what has been your favorite part so far that we've encountered?
I think I have two favorite parts, honestly, because there's two sides to me. The first is the some people have described me as like an old man who also happens to be like a teenager with no maturity. the old man. Really appreciated most of this conversation. Just in general, I've appreciated this trip with you. I just think this is such a really profound topic that a lot of people don't really think about enough. But the wild teenager in me really just loved when we went to Ellicala Falls. And we went, under the actual water itself. Because again, like I said, down there's absolutely something to be said for the risk and the strenuous effort that you put in to be able to stand or sit or get soaked in a place where very few people have dared to go before. So I would say this and that are my favorite parts. What about you?
I have many, many favorite parts of this trip. I'm just happy, honestly, to be able to hop on a plane and fly partway across the country, hop out, get in a car with a good friend, and drive all the way out here. Like, it's just the experience for me, like the experience in total. But I've really loved the fact that we're close enough to so many amazing sites that, like, every spot that we went to was completely different. Like, it had a different, environment, different vibe.
Yeah, both in terms of like the view, but also just the physical experience of being in that. Some were vantage points, but others were like you were quite literally in it.
So now I want to pose to you the biggest and most important question of this trip yet.
Let's go.
And that is, are you ready to go home?
I'll answer it this way. It's not that I'm ready to go home. I think I already was ready to go home, but I think I'm ready to go home and be more present in where my home is. Because I think sometimes you can be in your home and just mentally still be kind of far away. And I think that's been me for, past couple months. I think this trip has really been good to get me back in the headspace of, remember what's important. How about you?
I am ready to sleep in a bed. I wouldn't say that I'm ready to go home, especially because being out here, like, we've had so much time to like ponder and have fun and experience so much, especially a place that we've like never been before.
Right.
I wouldn't say that I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to experience home again.
Yeah. Like you're prepared.
I am prepared.
Home is a place that's familiar to me. It's like my own personal space away from everything else, and it just brings comfort and warmth to me. Home is a place that I can feel safe.
Home to me is two places. It is New Mexico. It's where I was born and raised. It's where I learned all my life lessons, and just where I became me. And two would be my parents' house. It's where I literally was raised. It's everything I know. It's everything to me.
I think to me, home is somewhere where I feel like I can be myself, where I can feel safe and protected, and where I feel loved.
Home is wherever my wife, daughter, and fur babies are. It is the place that I feel most safe, most comfortable, and most loved.
Home to me is where the Wi-Fi connects automatically. It's where the heart feels full and it feels like the food you eat is just better. Everyone around you is a little bit nicer and you just belong. You you're part of a creed, a part of a tribe, and home is where you feel that the most.
Home is recreated with a dish that mom made for you as a kid, or an animal that you've had for a long time, or seeing a loved one. Home is a feeling. It's a feeling of warmth and belonging.
I told you, we're lost. We're lost. I'm telling you. We should have turned left back there. Well,